The children of Elisharoman 4 woke to golden sunlight every morning, and they never knew fear. That was the whole point of the Cradle Worlds. Humanity had spread across more than 200 star systems by the year 2847, and it had built wonders that would make ancient kings weep with jealousy. But nothing made humans prouder than the Cradle Worlds, and there were 12 of them scattered across human space like jewels hidden inside a fist. Each one was a paradise dedicated entirely to raising and educating children, and each one was protected not by warships or orbital cannons, but by a single ancient promise that every species in the galaxy had heard at least once. Touch them and there will be no negotiation, no trial and no mercy. Most alien species thought this was dramatic nonsense, the kind of emotional bluster that mammals were famous for, and they smiled politely whenever humans mentioned it, the way one might smile at a friend who takes a board game too seriously. Admiral Renata Vasquez did not smile when she thought about the Cradle Worlds because her daughter lived on one of them. Renata was 53 years old with silver hair cut short and eyes that had seen the worst things the galaxy could offer, and she commanded the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet from the bridge of the heavy cruiser Adamantine, which was currently stationed at the edge of human space near the border of the Vreth Dominion. She had not spoken to her daughter Lena in 4 months, and this fact sat in her chest like a stone she could not swallow. Lena was 27, and she was a teacher on Elisharoman 4, where 3 million children between the ages of 3 and 16 lived and learned and played under skies that were always kind. And Lena loved her work with a passion that made Renata both proud and quietly heartbroken, because Lena had chosen the classroom over everything else, including her mother. Their last conversation had ended badly, as most of their conversations did, with Renata saying something about safety and Lena saying something about how not everything in the universe required a warship. And then silence, the kind of silence that grows teeth. But the children of Elisharoman 4 did not know about any of this because children are not supposed to carry the weight of adults, and that was another thing the Cradle Worlds were designed to prevent. On Elisharoman 4, the schools were built into hillsides covered in wildflowers, and the dormitories had windows that faced the ocean, and every classroom had real wooden doors, because someone a long time ago had decided that children should grow up touching real things and knowing what a tree smelled like. And so the Cradle Worlds were built with wood and stone and glass instead of steel and composite, and they felt like home in a way that space stations never could. Lena taught literature to 12-year-olds, and she was good at it because she believed that stories were the most important technology humanity had ever invented, more important than faster-than-light travel, more important than fusion reactors, more important than anything because stories taught you how to be a person before the universe tried to teach you how to be a survivor. She was in the middle of explaining an old Earth novel to her class when she felt her communicator buzz against her wrist, but she ignored it because the children were finally paying attention, and that mattered more than almost anything. Far away from the golden sunlight and the wooden doors and the wildflowers, the galaxy was not nearly as kind. The conquered of civilizations was the closest thing the galaxy had to a government, and it was about as effective as most governments, which is to say it talked a great deal and accomplished somewhat less, but it kept the peace more often than not, and that counted for something. Dozens of alien species sat in its assembly halls and debated trade routes and territorial boundaries, and the correct way to address a Kelvori diplomat without accidentally proposing marriage. And among all of these species, humanity occupied a strange position. Humans were mid-tier by galactic standards, not the strongest and not the weakest, not the oldest and certainly not the youngest, but there was something about them that made other species uneasy in a way that was hard to name, like sitting next to someone at a dinner party who seemed perfectly friendly, but who you suspected could kill everyone in the room if the conversation went badly enough. The Vreth Dominion had no such uncertainty about itself. The Vreth were insectoid, tall and angular with exoskeletons the color of dried blood, and they moved through the galaxy the way a fire moves through dry grass, with expansion as their only setting, and they had been growing more aggressive for decades, swallowing smaller species and strip-mining their worlds with the calm efficiency of something that does not recognize other life as anything more than material. Their supreme clade mother Thessaker ruled from a throne of fused bone in the heart of their home system, and she had 16 eyes that never blinked and a mind that thought in terms of resources and obstacles and nothing else. And she had decided that humanity was an obstacle. Not because humans were the strongest species in the galaxy, but because they were the most stubborn, the most unpredictable, the most annoyingly unwilling to do the sensible thing and submit when faced with superior numbers. In a war council deep inside a Vreth command hive, strategists clicked and hissed as they debated how to break humanity quickly and decisively, because a long war with humans was something even the Vreth wanted to avoid. One strategist, a senior tactical mind named Vrektas, proposed something that made even the other Vreth pause. Strike the cradle worlds. The logic was sound by Vreth standards, and Vrektas laid it out with cold precision. Humans were irrationally attached to their young in a way that most insectoid species found baffling and slightly disgusting, and if you destroyed the places where they kept their young, then the grief would shatter their unity, and their will to fight would collapse like a structure with its foundation removed. Several members of the council shifted uncomfortably, because even among the Vreth there were those who understood that some lines existed for reasons that went beyond strategy, but Thessaker silenced them with a single click of her mandibles. She authorized the plan. She did not understand what she was authorizing because she had spent her entire life in a species that produced thousands of offspring and felt nothing when most of them died. And she could not imagine a species that would burn the entire galaxy down for a single child, and this failure of imagination would cost her everything. Within days, Vreth stealth fleets slipped past the border of human space, using routes that had been mapped by spies over years of patient observation. And they moved in complete silence toward coordinates that corresponded to a small blue-green world with golden sunlight and wildflowers, and 3 million children who had never known fear. On the bridge of the adamantine Admiral Renata Vasquez reviewed routine patrol reports and thought about calling her daughter, and decided she would do it tomorrow, because there was always tomorrow. On Elisharoman 4, Lena Vasquez closed her book and smiled at her students and told them they had done wonderful work today, and she meant it with her whole heart. The Vreth fleet moved closer. The golden sunlight continued to fall on the wooden doors and the wildflowers and the children who slept without nightmares, and the galaxy held its breath without knowing why, the way a forest goes quiet just before something terrible steps out of the shadows. The Vreth fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Elisharoman 4 at exactly 14 minutes past midnight local time, and the sky above the sleeping children filled with dark shapes that blotted out the stars like a hand closing over a candle. There were 47 warships in the fleet, and each one was bristling with weapons designed to crack open planetary defenses, and below them was a world that had no planetary defenses at all, because it had never been designed to fight. The small human garrison stationed in orbit consisted of 12 corvettes and a supply frigate, and they were not a military force in any real sense but more of a symbolic presence, a reminder that this world belonged to someone. The way a fence around a garden is not meant to stop an army but simply to say this is ours. Captain David Herrera commanded the garrison, and he was a quiet man from a colony world who had taken this posting, because it was supposed to be peaceful, and because he liked knowing that the thing he protected actually mattered in a simple and uncomplicated way. And when his sensor officer screamed that there were Vreth warships everywhere, he did not freeze, and he did not panic. He did the only two things that mattered. First, he ordered every corvette to engage the enemy fleet, knowing full well that 12 corvettes against 47 warships was not a battle but a sentence. And second, he activated the emergency distress pulse on every frequency humanity used, and several that it did not. And the pulse screamed outward at the speed of light, and then faster than light through quantum relay stations that boosted it across the galaxy like a scream passed from mouth to mouth across a crowded room. The corvettes lasted 9 minutes. Captain Herrera's ship, the Gentle Morning, was the last to die, and its final transmission was not words but sensor data, clear and precise, showing the Vreth fleet and the planet below, and the bombardment that had already begun, because David Herrera knew that the most useful thing he could do with his last few seconds of life was to make sure everyone knew exactly what was happening and exactly who was doing it. Then the Gentle Morning broke apart, and David Herrera and his crew became part of the silence between the stars. On the surface, Lena Vasquez woke to a sound she had never heard before, which was the emergency siren that every cradle world had installed, but that no one had ever expected to actually use. And for 3 seconds she lay in her bed, and her mind refused to accept what her ears were telling her. And then the window of her room turned orange with reflected fire from something burning in the distance, and she was on her feet and running. The protocols for this situation existed because humans planned for everything, including things they believed would never happen, and Lena had been trained on them the way all Cradle World staff were trained on them, with a quiet seriousness that always felt slightly absurd, like practicing for a flood on a world with no water. She did not feel absurd now. She ran through the corridors of the dormitory pulling children out of their beds, and she was not gentle because gentle would get them killed. And she told them to move and to stay together and to not look at the windows. And her voice was calm even though her hands were shaking, because the children needed her voice to be calm. And so it was calm, and that was that. Other teachers and caretakers were doing the same thing across the settlement, pulling children from beds and classrooms and playgrounds, and herding them toward the underground shelters that had been built beneath every major structure on the planet. And the shelters were deep and reinforced and stocked with supplies for months, because whoever had designed them had understood that if this day ever came, the people inside would need to survive long enough for help to arrive. The sky above them was falling. Vreth orbital strikes hit the surface in patterns designed for maximum destruction and minimum efficiency, because the goal was not to conquer this world, but to wound it so deeply that the species who loved it would never recover, and the beautiful wooden schools splintered into burning fragments, and the hillsides covered in wildflowers became craters, and the ocean boiled where energy beams touched it. Lena got her group of children into a shelter beneath the main school complex and sealed the door and held a 6-year-old boy who was crying so hard he could not breathe. And she pressed his face against her shoulder so he would not see the dust falling from the ceiling with every impact. And she whispered to him that everything would be all right, and she did not know if she was lying. Above them, Vreth ground troops descended in drop pods, tall angular shapes with weapons that clicked and hummed, and they moved through the burning ruins with a purpose that had been described to them as sanitization, which was a word that made murder sound like cleaning. The distress pulse reached the first human relay station 11 minutes after Captain Herrera sent it, and from there it multiplied and spread across human space like a shockwave, touching every ship and every station and every colony and every outpost. And everywhere it touched, humans stopped what they were doing. They stopped talking and they stopped working, they stopped eating and they stopped laughing. On the bridge of the Adamantine, Admiral Renata Vasquez was reviewing fleet readiness reports when her communications officer made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a scream. And Renata looked up and saw the distress code on the main display. And she read the origin coordinates, and she knew them, because she had memorized them years ago the way a mother memorizes the address of her child's school. Elisha Roman 4. Her daughter's world. Something happened inside Renata Vasquez in that moment, and it was not what most people would expect because She did not scream, and she did not collapse, and she did not weep. And instead something very old and very cold settled behind her eyes like a door closing on a furnace. And the heat was still there, but it was contained now and directed and infinitely more dangerous than it would have been if she had simply exploded with grief. Every human military channel in the galaxy went silent for exactly 9 seconds. This was called the breath before the storm, and it was not a regulation or a protocol, but a tradition that had existed for so long that no one remembered who started it. And it was the sound of an entire species taking one last breath of who they were before they became what they needed to be. Then every channel erupted at once. Fleet commands issued mobilization orders and reserve units activated, and shipyards that had been producing cargo vessels began retooling for war. And all of it happened with a speed and coordination that would have been terrifying to watch from the outside, because it revealed something that most alien species preferred not to think about, which was that humanity had always been ready for this. Not because they wanted it, but because they had always known in some deep and primal way that the universe would eventually come for their children, and they had been preparing for that day since before they left Earth. On the bridge of the Adamantine, Renata turned to her executive officer, and her voice was steady and flat, and completely empty of everything except purpose. "Wake the Reapers." Her executive officer went pale because he knew what that meant, even though he had never expected to hear those words spoken aloud in his lifetime, and he nodded and turned to carry out the order. Far away in the conquered of civilizations, assembly halls, alien diplomats watched their human counterparts and saw something that made many of them deeply uncomfortable, because the human ambassadors, who were usually warm and smiling and quick with a joke, had gone quiet and still in a way that did not look like grief, but looked like something else entirely, something that had no name in most alien languages. Ambassador Torvan of the Keth Republic had studied humans for 40 years, and he was considered the foremost non-human expert on human behavior. And he watched the human delegation with all 4 of his eyes, and he felt something he had not felt in decades, which was genuine fear. He leaned toward his aide and spoke in a whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "The humans are not angry, and that would be survivable, but they are quiet, and when humans go quiet, it means that extinction is on the table and not as a metaphor." His aide asked whose extinction. Torvan looked at him with an expression that on a Keth face meant profound sadness. That is the question the Vreth should have asked before they launched their fleet. The word Reaper had been whispered in alien diplomatic circles for centuries, the way ghost stories are whispered around campfires, with just enough belief to make the telling uncomfortable, and just enough doubt to make it easy to dismiss in daylight. Most species assumed it was a myth, a piece of human psychological warfare, a boogeyman designed to make enemies hesitate. Because surely no civilization would actually build an entire military doctrine around a single scenario, and then leave it dormant for hundreds of years like a bomb buried under a garden. They were wrong. The Reaper Protocol was real, and it was very simple, and it had been written in the blood-red ink of absolute conviction by the founders of the first human colonial defense force after a war that most humans no longer remembered, but whose lesson they had carved into the bedrock of their civilization. The protocol had one trigger, which was a deliberate attack on human children, and one mandate, which was that the aggressor species would be made an example of so complete and so devastating that no civilization would ever consider such an act again for as long as stars burned. It had never been activated. The document itself was stored in every human military database, and every commanding officer above the rank of captain had read it at least once, and most of them had read it with the quiet discomfort of someone reading their own funeral arrangements, because the protocol did not just authorize military response, but demanded total commitment. The complete and absolute redirection of human civilization, from a peacetime footing to a war footing with no half measures and no limitations, and no exit strategy short of victory. Admiral Vasquez transmitted the activation codes from the bridge of the adamantine, and they propagated through human space like fire through oxygen. And within hours, the machinery of the protocol began to move. It was a terrible and awe-inspiring thing to watch. On colony worlds across human space factories that had been producing agricultural equipment and consumer goods shut down their production lines and began manufacturing weapons and ammunition and armor plating. And the transition happened so smoothly that it revealed something the galaxy had never suspected, which was that human factories had been designed from the beginning with dual-use capability. That every assembly line that made tractors could make tanks, and every facility that made medical scanners could make targeting systems. And this had been the plan all along, quiet and patient and waiting. Retired soldiers received activation notices on their personal communicators, and they did not argue, and they did not ask questions, and they reported to their nearest military installation within hours. Millions of them, men and women and people of every description who had put down their weapons years or decades ago, and who picked them up again now with hands that remembered. Civilian ships were pulled into orbital shipyards and retrofitted with weapons and armor in operations that took days, instead of the weeks they should have taken, because the plans for these retrofits had existed in sealed files for generations, updated regularly by engineers who hoped they would never be needed. The human economy stopped. Not slowed, not adjusted, not redirected, but stopped, the way a heart stops between beats. And when it started again, it was beating to a different rhythm, one that pumped not commerce but war material through the veins of human civilization, and every human understood why, and not one of them objected. This was what the galaxy did not understand about humans, and what the Vreth had fatally miscalculated. Human beings would argue about anything. They would fight among themselves over politics and religion, and whether a particular food should be served hot or cold. They would fracture into factions and bicker endlessly about things that did not matter. But there were lines that, when crossed, united every single human alive into a single organism with a single purpose. And the harming of children was not just one of those lines, but the line. The one written so deep that it was not cultural but biological, older than language, older than civilization, older than fire. The conquered of civilizations called an emergency session, and the assembly hall was full for the first time in decades, because every species in the galaxy wanted to see what would happen next. Several species urged restraint, and their ambassadors spoke with carefully measured words about proportional response and diplomatic channels, and the importance of not allowing emotion to override reason. And they meant well, and they were not wrong in principle. But they were speaking to a species that was no longer listening to principle. The human representative ambassador Idris Okonkwo attended the session, and he walked to the podium with the slow, measured steps of a man carrying something very heavy, and his face was calm, and his suit was perfect, and his voice when he spoke was so controlled that it frightened several delegates more than shouting would have. He read a prepared statement, and it was short. We will accept the unconditional surrender of the Vreth Dominion, the surrender of all individuals involved in the planning and execution of the attack on Elisha-Roman 4, and the complete and permanent dismantlement of their military capability, and they have 48 standard hours to comply. And after that, we will no longer be accepting surrenders. The chamber erupted with noise and objections and demands for clarification, and Okonkwo stood at the podium and waited for silence with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world, because the clock was not ticking for him. A delegate from the Morsi Confederation stood and demanded to know what humanity intended to do if the Vreth did not surrender, and whether humanity understood that it was threatening genocide. Okonkwo looked at the delegate for a long moment, and then said that he had delivered his statement, and that there was nothing to add, and then he left the podium and walked out of the chamber. In the silence that followed, Ambassador Torvin of the Keth Republic stood and addressed the assembly, and his voice was heavy with a sadness that his species rarely showed in public. He told them that they did not understand what they were witnessing, and that he had studied humans for 40 years, and that what Ambassador Okonkwo had just done was not a threat and not a negotiating position, but something far worse. He told them that Okonkwo was not making a threat. He was reading a eulogy. The assembly fell silent, and several delegates looked at each other with expressions that crossed every species barrier, and said the same thing, which was, "Oh." On Elisha 4, the situation was growing desperate. Lena Vasquez and a group of 37 teachers and caretakers had consolidated in the largest underground shelter beneath the central school complex, and they had with them over 400 children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, and the shelter was holding, but the sounds from above were getting closer. The Vreth ground troops were systematic and thorough, and they moved through the ruins of the settlement, checking every structure and every hiding place, and they communicated in rapid clicks that sounded like gravel being poured on metal, and they did not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, because in their framework there was no such distinction. Lena organized the adults into shifts, some watching the children and keeping them calm and fed, others monitoring the shelter's systems and the few external cameras that still functioned. And she did all of this with a competence that surprised even her, because she had never thought of herself as someone who could lead in a crisis. But it turned out that when the crisis involved children, she could lead just fine. A teenager named Arav, who was 16, and who had been learning electronics as a hobby, managed to boost the shelter's communication array enough to pick up fragments of transmissions from outside the system. And what he heard made him close his eyes and take a breath before he told Lena. "They are coming," he said, and he did not mean the Vreth. Lena asked how he knew. "Because I can hear every human fleet in the galaxy talking at once," he said, "and they are all saying the same thing." Lena looked at him and he looked back at her, and neither of them needed to ask what the fleets were saying, because they already knew. Above them, the Vreth troops drew closer to the shelter entrance, and the heavy door that separated 400 children from something unspeakable groaned under the first testing impacts of alien weapons. Lena picked up a fire extinguisher because it was the closest thing to a weapon she could find, and she stood facing the door, and behind her, the other teachers did the same with whatever they could grab, chairs and tools and pieces of broken equipment. And behind them, 400 children huddled together in the dark. She was a teacher and not a soldier, and she knew that if that door opened she would die. But she also knew that she would die standing between the Vreth and the children, and that this was not courage, but simply what a human does when someone comes for the young. The door groaned again and dust fell from the ceiling, and the children were silent now, with the terrible silence of small creatures who have learned that sound means danger. Lena tightened her grip on the fire extinguisher and waited. The 48 hours expired at noon Galactic Standard Time, and the galaxy watched, and the Vreth Dominion did not surrender. Supreme Clade Mother Thessiker had broadcast a response on open channels 12 hours before the deadline, and she had called humanity's ultimatum the desperate bleating of a grief-stricken herd animal, and she had promised that any human fleet entering Vreth space would be consumed the way all soft things are consumed by the hard and the strong. She believed this because she had looked at the numbers, and the Vreth Dominion had more ships and more soldiers and more territory than humanity, and numbers do not lie, except when they do, except when the numbers fail to account for something that cannot be measured by counting ships or soldiers or systems. The numbers did not account for what happens when you hurt a human's child. At 1200 hours and 1 second the human fleets arrived, and they did not come from one direction like a conventional military assault, but from every direction simultaneously, because human forces had spent the last 48 hours positioning themselves in a sphere around Vreth space using faster-than-light jumps coordinated with a precision that military analysts from other species would study for centuries afterward and never fully replicate. There were hundreds of warships, heavy cruisers and battle cruisers and carriers and destroyers, and behind them came thousands of armed transports and converted civilian vessels packed with volunteers who had crossed human space in days to be here, not because they were ordered to, but because they could not have stayed away any more than a river could choose not to flow downhill. The Vreth Border Defense Fleet encountered the human vanguard, and the battle lasted 4 hours, and it was not a battle in any meaningful sense, but a demonstration of what happens when technical capability meets absolute commitment, because the human ships fought with a recklessness that the Vreth had no framework for understanding. Human captains rammed their ships into Vreth formations to create openings for the vessels behind them, and the crews of those ships did not hesitate, because hesitation was something that belonged to the species they had been 2 days ago, and the species they were now did not hesitate and did not stop, and did not care about survival in any way that the Vreth could exploit. The Vreth border fleet was destroyed. Admiral Renata Vasquez led the strike force assigned to liberate Elisharoman IV, and she brought 30 warships and a full marine division, and she drove them through the Vreth blockade above her daughter's world with a tactical aggression that her own officers found almost frightening. The Vreth fleet above Elisharoman IV had 47 ships and Renata's force had 30, and the math should have favored the Vreth. But the math did not account for the fact that Renata Vasquez knew her daughter was on the surface below, and she did not know if her daughter was alive, and this uncertainty had transformed her from a competent admiral into something that had no name in any military textbook. She broke the blockade in 6 hours and she lost 11 ships doing it, and every crew that died transmitted the same final message, which was 2 words: for the children. And this was not a slogan but a statement of accounting, a record of what they were purchasing with their lives. With the blockade shattered, human marines descended to the surface of Elisharoman IV in drop pods that punched through the atmosphere like iron rain, and they hit the ground running with weapons hot, and a fury in their blood that made them faster and stronger and more dangerous than they had any biological right to be. The Vreth ground troops had been operating unopposed on the surface for nearly 3 days, and they had grown comfortable with their dominance, the way any predator grows comfortable when there is nothing to challenge it. And the arrival of human marines shattered that comfort like a boot through glass. The fighting on the surface was close and brutal and deeply personal, in a way that wars conducted with starships and orbital strikes are not, because the Marines could see the burned schools and the cratered playground and the small shoes scattered in the rubble, and every one of these things added fuel to something that was already burning beyond any hope of control. Sergeant Major Quaim Assant led the platoon that reached the central school complex, and when his scouts reported Vreth troops attempting to breach an underground shelter, his response was immediate and savage, and he led his people through the ruins at a dead sprint. They hit the Vreth from behind with no warning and no mercy, and the engagement lasted 12 minutes, and when it was over, every Vreth soldier near the shelter was dead, and Sergeant Major Assant was standing at the shelter door with blood on his armor that was not his own, and he knocked on the heavy metal door 3 times, and then he said in a voice that cracked on every other word, "This is the United Human Marine Corps, and you are safe now, and we are not leaving." Inside the shelter, Lena Vasquez heard those words and her knees buckled, and she dropped the fire extinguisher she had been holding for hours, and she sat down on the cold floor, and she cried with her whole body while 400 children watched her, and did not understand why the adult who had been so strong was suddenly falling apart. And the answer was that she was falling apart because she did not have to be strong anymore, and sometimes that is the moment when everything breaks. The shelter door opened, and the Marines entered, and they were large and armed and covered in dust and blood, and they were the most beautiful thing Lena had ever seen. One Marine, a young woman who could not have been older than 20, knelt in front of a group of small children and took off her helmet, and her face was dirty, and her eyes were red, and she smiled at them and asked if anyone wanted a candy bar. And several children nodded, and she produced candy bars from her pack and handed them out with hands that were still trembling from combat. Admiral Vasquez landed on the surface 2 hours after the area was secured, and she walked through the ruins of the settlement she had seen only in photographs that her daughter had sent. Photographs of sunlit classrooms and laughing children that now corresponded to nothing but wreckage. And she walked until she found the shelter, and she went inside. Lena saw her mother and Renata saw her daughter, and they stood looking at each other across the crowded shelter, full of children, and neither of them moved for a long moment because there was too much between them. Years of silence and stubbornness and things unsaid. Then Renata crossed the distance and held her daughter, and Lena held her mother, and they did not speak, because there was nothing that words could do that this could not do better. Renata pulled back and looked at the children in the shelter, 400 small faces looking up at her, dirty and scared and alive, and something in her face broke open and then sealed shut again in the space of a single breath. And she kissed her daughter's forehead and turned and walked back to the war. Because HFY 4 was only the beginning. The human fleets did not stop at liberation. They pushed into Vreth space like a blade into flesh, system by system, colony by colony. And the speed of their advance was something the galaxy had never seen, because the humans were not fighting a war of conquest but a war of reckoning, and these are very different things. A war of conquest takes what it wants and stops. A war of reckoning takes everything and does not stop until the lesson is complete. The Vreth Dominion, which had terrorized its region of space for centuries, found itself being disassembled by a species it had considered soft and sentimental. And the humans were not soft. They were simply beings who kept their hardness locked away until someone gave them a reason to bring it out. And the Vreth had given them every reason. Alien observers embedded with human fleets sent reports back to the conquered, and the reports were consistent in their tone, which was a mixture of professional admiration and something close to religious terror. A Keth journalist named Pelara, who had been covering human affairs for 2 decades, filed a dispatch that was republished across the galaxy, and it said this: I have seen humans laugh at bad jokes and cry at beautiful music, and spend hours arguing about which flavor of ice cream is best, and I have watched them build hospitals on worlds that were not their own simply because someone was sick and needed help. And I am now watching this same species reduce a stellar empire to cinders in 11 days. And I do not think the galaxy has ever truly understood what lives alongside us. And I think we should be very grateful that they have chosen to like us. On the Vreth homeworld, Thessaker watched the strategic displays in her command center as system after system went dark, and she felt something she had never felt before, which was the cold, crawling recognition that she had made a mistake so vast that her mind could not fully contain it. She had thought she was attacking a nation and breaking its will. She had attacked a family. And families do not break, they burn, and everything they touch burns with them. The Vreth Dominion fell in 19 days. 19 days to unmake a civilization that had taken 12 centuries to build, and the galaxy watched it happen the way one watches a landslide, with the understanding that the ground beneath your own feet is made of the same earth and could move just as easily. The human fleet swept through Vreth space with a coordination that was almost mechanical in its precision, and system after system fell not because the Vreth did not fight, but because they fought a species that would not stop, that could not be intimidated, that treated every Vreth counterattack not as a setback, but as a personal insult that required an even more devastating response. Supreme Clade Mother Thessaker was captured on the 17th day when human special forces breached her command bunker on the Vreth homeworld, and the soldiers who took her into custody were quiet and professional, and they did not harm her even though every one of them wanted to, and this restraint cost them more than any battle they had fought in the preceding weeks. She was brought before a human tribunal, and she stood in chains made of a metal she did not recognize, and she looked at the human judges with her 16 unblinking eyes, and she did not beg because her species did not beg. But for the first time in her existence, she understood that she was in the presence of something she had fundamentally misread, and that this misreading had killed her empire. The Vreth military was dissolved, every ship disarmed, every weapon confiscated, every command structure dismantled, and the thoroughness of it was absolute because the humans were not interested in leaving anything that could regrow into a threat. The leadership of the Dominion was tried individually, and the trials were fair in a way that surprised the galactic community, because fairness was not what anyone expected from a species that had just fought a war of annihilation. But the humans insisted on it with a stubbornness that was by now deeply familiar to everyone. Thessaker and the members of her war council who had planned and authorized the attack on Elisha-Roman IV were convicted and sentenced. And the sentences were severe, but they were sentences and not executions, because the tribunal operated under human law, and human law, even at its most furious, still had rules. And then something happened that the galaxy did not expect. The humans stopped. They had conquered the Vreth Dominion completely, and they had the power to do anything they wanted with it, to dismantle the species, to scatter the survivors, to reduce the Vreth homeworld to a cinder, as a monument to the consequences of touching humanity's children. And there were humans who wanted exactly this. Voices in the public sphere who called for the extinction of the Vreth the way the Vreth had tried to extinguish the children of Elisha-Roman IV. But that is not what happened. What happened was that human doctors landed on Vreth worlds and began treating wounded Vreth civilians, and human engineers arrived and began repairing infrastructure that human weapons had destroyed, and human aid workers distributed food and medical supplies to Vreth population centers that had been cut off from resources during the war. The galaxy watched this with something beyond confusion, something closer to a kind of vertigo, because the same species that had just waged the most ferocious military campaign in living memory was now feeding and healing the survivors of the enemy it had just crushed. And these were not different humans but the same humans, soldiers who put down their weapons and picked up medical kits, pilots who had been dropping ordnance a week ago, now dropping supply crates. Ambassador Torvan of the Keth Republic sat in his quarters on the conquered station and watched the reports come in, and he wept, which was something Keth almost never did. And when his aide asked him why he was weeping, he said it was because he had finally understood humans completely, and the understanding was too large for his heart to hold without breaking. He said that any species in the galaxy could destroy an enemy, and many species could show mercy to a defeated foe if it served their interests. But only humans could burn a civilization to the ground in 19 days, and then kneel in the ashes and bandage the wounds of the people who lived there. Not because it served any strategic purpose, but because there were Vreth children in those ruins, and human beings could not walk past a wounded child regardless of what species that child belonged to. This, he said, was why humans were the most terrifying species in the galaxy, not because of their capacity for destruction, which was considerable, but because of their capacity for choice, because they could have been monsters and instead chose to be something else. And that choice was made fresh every single day, and it cost them something every single day, and they made it anyway. Ambassador Okonkwo addressed the conquered of civilizations one final time in a session that was broadcast to every world in the galaxy. He stood at the same podium where he had delivered his ultimatum weeks earlier, and he looked older than he had then, not in years but in weight. The kind of age that comes from carrying something heavy across a great distance. He spoke without notes. We could have ended them, he said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the silent chamber, every last one of them. And you know it, and they know it, and we know it. He paused. We chose not to, he said, because we are not what they made us become for those 19 days. And we will spend years finding our way back to who we were before this happened, and some of us will never find our way back. And that is the cost of what was done to our children, and it is a cost that the Vreth can never repay. He looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of dozens of species. But let this stand as a permanent record entered into the archives of every civilization present. He said, "Our mercy is a choice and not a weakness, and it is a choice we will not always make." The chamber was silent for a long time after he finished. Torvin of the Keth Republic proposed what came to be known as the Elisha Accords, a new framework of galactic law that declared attacks on any species' children to be a crime that would trigger a collective and overwhelming military response from all signatory species. And the framework was comprehensive and detailed, and it had teeth, because it was backed not by abstract principles, but by the very concrete memory of what humanity had just done. Every species in the Concord signed the Accords. Some signed out of genuine moral conviction, because the attack on Elisha Roman 4 had horrified them, and they wanted to ensure nothing like it ever happened again. Most signed out of fear, because they had watched a mid-tier species tear apart an empire in less than 3 weeks, and they understood that the Elisha Accords were not really a new law, but a formalization of something that had always been true, which was that humanity would protect its children with everything it had, and now the rest of the galaxy was being invited to either stand with them or stand aside. No one wanted to stand aside. Years passed. The Vreth Dominion ceased to exist as a political entity and was replaced by a collection of self-governing Vreth states that operated under the terms of the peace settlement. And these states were demilitarized and monitored, and they struggled with the transition from an empire built on conquest to a society that had to learn how to exist without taking from others. It was not easy for them, but it was possible, and this possibility was itself a gift that the Vreth did not fully appreciate, because the alternative had been no future at all. Elisha Roman 4 was rebuilt. It took years, and the new schools were built on the foundations of the old ones, and they used wood and stone and glass, just as before, because the humans who designed them refused to let fear change the fundamental character of what a cradle world was supposed to be. And the wildflowers were replanted, and the ocean no longer boiled, and the sunlight was still golden every morning. Lena Vasquez returned to teaching. She was different now in ways that were not visible from the outside, but that she felt every day, a certain heaviness behind her eyes, a tendency to count the children in her class more often than necessary, a flinch at loud noises that she could not entirely control. But she was there, and she was teaching, and the children were learning, and this was enough. She spoke to her mother more often now, not every day but every week, and their conversations were shorter and kinder, and they both understood without saying it that the distance between them had been closed not by words, but by the simple fact that they had both survived something that should have been unsurvivable. One autumn morning 3 years after the war, Lena arrived at her classroom to find 3 new students sitting quietly in the back row. They were Vreth. They were young, barely past their first molting, and they were the first exchange students sent to a human cradle world under the terms of the Elisha Accords, and they sat very still with their angular limbs folded carefully, as if they were trying to take up as little space as possible. The human children stared at them with the open curiosity that children have before adults teach them to be afraid, and Lena watched the 3 young Vreth struggle with a human picture book, turning the pages with their delicate mandibles and clicking softly to each other in confusion at the illustrations. She gave her class an assignment, and then she walked to the back of the room and sat down near the 3 Vreth students, and she watched them for a moment. One of them looked up at her with eyes that were too large for its face, and it spoke in halting galactic common, the words clicking and buzzing in a way that made them hard to understand but not impossible. "Teacher," it said, "why did your people let us live?" Lena looked at this child, this Vreth child who was so young and so far from home and so clearly frightened of the answer, and she thought about the burning schools and the cratered hillsides, and the sound of weapons hitting the shelter door, and the 6-year-old boy who had cried so hard he could not breathe. And she thought about Sergeant Major Asant's voice cracking as he told them they were safe. And she thought about her mother's arms around her in that crowded shelter. And she thought about Ambassador Okonkwo standing at a podium, telling the galaxy that mercy was a choice. She knelt down so that she was at the young Vreth's eye level, and she smiled at it. And the smile was real, and it cost her something, but she gave it freely. "Because you are children," she said, "and that is the whole point." The young Vreth looked at her for a long moment, and then it looked down at the picture book in its hands, and then it looked back up at her, and it made a sound that Lena had never heard a Vreth make before, a soft clicking that rose and fell in a pattern that she did not recognize. Later she would learn that this sound was the Vreth equivalent of a child saying thank you. Outside the classroom window, the golden sunlight of Elisha 4 fell on the new wildflowers growing over the old scars, and somewhere in the distance children were laughing in 2 languages, and the galaxy turned and the stars burned and humanity's children were safe. For now, for today. And today was enough. It was always enough.